We're going to begin session 4. Our moderator is my good friend and individual who's been on board and a very positive supporter of our efforts since the inception, Phillipe Golden. Phillipe is a postdoctoral researcher in the psychology department here at Stanford. His clinical research focuses on functional neuroimaging, of which he is quite adept, and on the effect of mindfulness meditation and cognitive behavioral therapy on neurosubstrates of emotional reactivity, emotion regulation, and attention regulation. And he has a great interest in our mission, and I just want to thank him for that. And without further ado, Phillipe.
I'm going to introduce the next speaker, Felix Warneken, in the following way. The paper, the PDF that is actually on the website, I encourage you to read his paper. Altruistic, I don't remember the exact title, but it's altruistic behavior in 2 different kinds of animals, humans and chimpanzees, 18-month-olds and chimpanzees. And I read it on the Caltrain coming down to work a couple days ago, and I had a very good experience. It's an elegant, beautiful demonstration of taking an experimental paradigm to try to tease out altruistic behavior in 2 different animals. And I commend you for doing that for many reasons. And I encourage everyone to read it because it's really a beautiful piece of science and very clearly written. So with no further hesitation, introduce Felix again.
Thanks for the invitation, giving me the opportunity to present our work on human altruism based upon some evidence that we have with studies on young children and chimpanzees. So we know that humans, at least human adults, routinely act on behalf of others spontaneously without being asked to do so, without any direct personal gain, even at cost to themselves. They do that to familiar individuals, but they do it also towards strangers, and they do it anonymously. And this is a phenomenon that has been studied in social psychology, and most recently also in the behavioral economic literature, showing that this is something that's very common and also holds cross-culturally, especially the work by Joe Henrich shows this. So this fact that this seems to be quite robust raises the question about the origins, both in phylogeny and in ontogeny. And when we look at phylogeny, very often it is claimed that we were dealing here with a human unique psychology. So it's often assumed that we find altruistic behaviors only in humans based upon human-specific psychology, human-specific motivations to help others. And this is supposed to be something that we do not even find in our closest evolutionary relatives, the chimpanzees. And they are often characterized as animals that are, in contrast to humans, only guided by self-interest. And it is often assumed in these approaches that the reason why we find it only in humans is that we have cultural practices such as the internalization of social norms, moral conventions, etc., and that it is this culture as the main or even the only source that turns us into altruistic beings. The problem is that there are not many experimental comparisons between human children and chimpanzees to actually disentangle what aspects are species unique and what aspects we share with our evolutionary relatives. When it comes to the origins in ontogeny, once again, very often cultural practices are emphasized. So children are often viewed as being originally selfish individuals, and then through moral education, internalization of norms, etc., they gradually turn into beings that also act altruistically. And these claims are often based upon research with adults and school-aged children. But there is also the possibility, and Hoffman has proposed this most prominently, that maybe there is a predisposition very early in life to develop these altruistic behaviors. But the problem is that there are few experimental studies on altruism in very young children. I mean, there's a lot on school-age children, especially in the a paper that I would ask you to read, which is also on the website. This is the handbook chapter where Tracy Spinrad was one of the co-authors, because there they summarize all the data that is available on prosocial behavior in children. But this, again, is mainly about older children. And when we look at younger children, most of the research are naturalistic observations of sharing behavior, where we wouldn't even call it sharing very often, or empathic interventions. But not much is known about what I will talk about here. And I will have the following hypothesis. I want to defend the hypothesis that these socialization practices are existent, of course, but they build upon a biological predisposition that we have to develop altruism. And I will do that by providing evidence from experiments with young children to look at the earliest manifestations and the underlying psychological capacities for altruism, and complement that with comparative studies with chimpanzees as one of the two closest evolutionary relatives that we share, in order to look at the shared and the species unique aspects that we find. I also want to point out that very often non-human primates are just lumped together, right? But they're very, very different. And there's a difference between apes and monkeys. Chimps eat monkeys, right? They're not monkeys. And so the logic behind this is that we want to look at our closest evolutionary relative, the bonobos and the chimpanzees, who split from the human lineage around 6 million years ago. And the logic behind that is that if we have a behavior that we find in both species, or all three, I should say, then this is something that maybe possessed also our common ancestor. If it's something that we find only in humans and none of the other great ape species, then it's something that actually is human-specific. So what I will talk about here in particular is what we call instrumental helping. So the idea behind that is that we encounter several situations in which a person is faced with a concrete problem, retrieving an object that is out of reach, for example. And this is an interesting phenomenon, both cognitively, because in order to help someone, you first of all have to understand the goal that the other one is trying but failing to achieve. In addition, it's interesting motivationally, because in order to help, you have to have the motivation, and possibly the altruistic motivation, to act on behalf of the other and fill the missing link here. So this is what I will be talking about, and this is also something that's slightly different from the things that we've heard from Tracy Spinrad. So what do we know about the crucial capacities involved when it comes to young children? So we know that the cognitive aspect is present. So young children understand goals. Certainly by 12 months of age, they are able to understand other people's behaviors in terms of their goals. And slightly later, they are even able to infer goals that other people were trying but never actually achieving. And when it comes to the motivational component that supposedly is important for instrumental helping, the work on empathic intervention, empathy, sympathy, etc., also indicates that around the same age, in the second year of life, children have the motivation to act on behalf of others. When it comes to chimpanzees, this is always a bit more controversial, but now there's lots of evidence that also chimpanzees understand other people's actions in terms of goals. So they are able to infer what goals others are trying to achieve. But when it comes to the motivational component, at least the experimental evidence so far had been negative. So there are some anecdotes about pro-social altruistic behaviors in chimpanzees, mainly the ones summarized by Franz de Waal. But when it comes to the hard data, when it comes to the experiments, they were all negative. Namely, in the studies by Joan Silk and Keith Jensen, they created situations in which one chimpanzee had the opportunity to choose to either deliver food to another individual or not, and they did not discriminate. So they were indifferent to the welfare of the other according to these studies, and the conclusion from these studies is that they have no altruistic tendencies whatsoever. So with this in mind, I will present a few experiments on helping in young children. So in these experiments, we tested 18-month-olds, and in 10 different helping situations in which always a person was performing an action, then encountered a problem which prevented him from achieving his goal, and then the children had the opportunity to help. And we contrasted for each of these 10 helping situations an experimental condition in which the person actually needed help because he was trying to achieve this goal, with a control condition with the same objects, with the same basic situation, but no indication that this was a problem for the adult. And because we were interested in spontaneous helping, helping was never solicited, we provided no rewards and no praise if the children helped. So here's one example. What you will see is a split screen film with me standing on the right, using clothespins to hang towels on a line, and then I accidentally drop the clothespin on the floor and I'm unsuccessfully reaching for it. So, here, oh. So what we found in this and other out-of-reach tasks in which in the experimental condition a person dropped something on the ground or something was out of reach and he reached for it, the children would help quite frequently, here highlighted in green. And they did so significantly more often than in control conditions in which, for example, in this clothespin task, I would also stand there with clothespins, but I would throw them on the ground on purpose and not reach for it. And in this case, the children did not pick it up. So this rules out alternative hypotheses like they just want to interact with me, or they like to see things falling to the ground, or they are very, they would just want to clean up or something. So this does not seem to be the case. So we had other, but we also were interested in their cognitive flexibility. So we provided them, we showed them other types of problems. One with a physical obstacle. In this task, I put magazines into a cabinet. I close the doors, go to the other end of the room to get another stack of magazines, and then upon return, I have the problem that the doors are closed and my hands are full. Oh. Oh. So, and also here we find that the children would open the doors for the person in the experimental condition, but not so in the control condition, in which I also bump into the doors, but not because I try to put the magazines inside, but because I have problems lifting them on top of the cabinet. And they also do something that's maybe the most complex version of this. So they are first shown a novel box with a small hole on top and a flap on the side. And with a different experimenter, they're allowed to use the flap twice. And then later on during the test, I have this box and I have my tea, and then I accidentally drop the spoon through the hole. And I'm so stupid, and I try to squeeze my hand through the tiny hole. Oh. So even in this case, where the person is using the wrong means, they can correct me, and they do so in the experimental condition, but not in the control condition in which I throw the spoon inside on purpose. And they do something even when they have never seen me achieve my goal. So they just see a stack of books in front of them, and then I always try to put it on top, but always fail in the experimental condition. So. Oh. 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 So also in this case, they help and they can infer what I intended to do but never really observed. but in a control condition in which we just put the stuff in front of them, they do not stack it on top so often. So it's not because they are reminded of building towers that they do this. So this indicates that they're quite flexible in their helping at 18 months of age already, because they help in various situations with different types of goals and different types of intervention. And it's also apparent across individuals. So in this study, 90% of individuals helped in at least one of the tasks. I should also point out we have another study published in 2007 where even 14-month-old would help, at least in these out-of-reach situations. So this shows that this is a behavior that is apparent very early in ontogeny, so young children help others in various contexts. So another question is, to what extent would they help if we increase the costs? Because in this case, I mean, the kid had to crawl, etc., but sometimes they were just sitting at the table. So maybe it's something that is constrained only to very low-cost helping. So, but let me tell you, we have major problems to get this extinct. So we try various ways in raising the costs, having them walk over obstacles, disengaging from other fun activities, and they continue to help at a very high rate, as you will see here. So this boy is having fun in the swimming pool over here, and then the person is dropping something on the ground and is reaching for it. Then the other question, of course, is when you look at altruistic behaviors, is it maybe guided by some immediate reward for themselves? So we wanted to test that as well. So in the previous studies, no reward was offered at all. But in another study, we manipulated whether children would receive a reward or not with the, again, unfamiliar human experimenter. And now we have, like in the previous study, cases where over 10 consecutive trials, the person is either reaching for the object that was out of reach or is not reaching for the object. So if the helping is guided by the other person's unachieved goal, we would expect to find more helping in the reaching than the no reaching condition. And the other factor that we introduce now is that the children are offered a reward in the reward condition or no reward in the no reward condition. And so if their helping is guided mainly by an immediate benefit for themselves, we would find more helping in that case. And what we found in this study with 18-month-olds again was actually that in replication of the previous one, reaching mattered. So that was what determined their helping, and whether they were offered a reward, a toy that they needed to play a game, didn't matter. And that was also true over 10 consecutive trials. So it was not the case that they initially thought they would get something, but after some time they should have learned it. And actually we re-invited them then some other day, and they continued to do that over 10 trials again. So rewards, at least immediate rewards, do not seem to drive it. So this led to the possible interpretation that they're intrinsically motivated to help others. And this is a curious phenomenon that we know from social psychology and from Mark Lepper, who's here at the psych department, who showed that when you have 3.5-year-old children and you pick out the ones that like to draw, for example, this is what he used, and then you divide it up into different experimental treatments, where in one condition they are supposed to draw in order to receive a reward, then when you observe them later on in a free play period at some other day, these children, in comparison to the ones who have never received a reward, are less likely to perform the previously intrinsically motivating activity of drawing. So the interpretation is that in these cases, when there initially is a high intrinsic motivation, external rewards are not just superfluous, they even undermine intrinsic motivation. So this is something that was quite controversial also when it came to schooling, and I think this will reappear because I think 2 days ago in the New York Times there was an article about people trying to reward pupils for attending class and good grades, etc. So well, I don't know about that. So, so we wanted to see if we maybe will find something similar when it comes to the helping behaviors in infants. And so what we did, we had first a treatment period in which the children either received a concrete reward or were praised, or the helpee responded neutrally to the helping act until children helped 5 times. And those children who did so, it was roughly 2/3, moved on to the actual test phase, in which the helpee was always responding neutrally over 9 trials, and we wanted to see if they continued to help. And because in pilot studies the helping rate was so high, we introduced a distractor toy. So in the test phase, the children, like this boy here was playing in the swimming pool, they were musicians. So they were playing with the saxophone or something and had to disengage from this fun activity in order to help. And the finding was that, as a matter of fact, children in the neutral and in the praise condition would help at a very high rate, but the ones who had previously been rewarded during the treatment showed a lower tendency to help in comparison to these other 2 groups. So it indicates that not only are they very motivated to help, but that extrinsic rewards might even undermine their intrinsic motivation. Okay, and so just one quick thing. The issue with all these studies was that we always had a parent sitting in the room, so it's at least conceivable that they were compliant to the mother and just wanted to get a good impression in front of her. So we did conducted a study with the same basic design, but now the mother was either actively encouraging the child to help, or was just observing, like we call it actually the big mother study. So big mother is watching you. Or the mother is absent altogether, again, until they helped 5 times. And then they proceeded to the test phase with these distractor toys, so we made the helping slightly costly. And the finding is that it didn't matter what condition we tested them in the treatment phase. Children in all 3 groups reached the 5 times helping criterion equally often, and there was also no transfer effect to the test phase. So it was not necessary, or did not increase the rate of helping, and also did not decrease the rate of helping if the mothers had encouraged them before. So they also help at a high rate, and there's no difference based upon the parental observation and control. Okay, so given that young children help already in the 2nd year of life, that they do so even if it involves some costs, at least energetic and opportunity costs, given that rewards do not seem to affect it, at least not positively, and that parental control does not have an effect, at least in the immediate situation, maybe we can put out the hypothesis that there is more to it than socialization. Maybe there is a biological predisposition. But the problem is that even though we find it in very young children, and even though these parental things that we controlled here had no effect, it's possible that maybe they just need minimal socialization experiences, or they are predisposed to learn it very quickly in the 2nd year of life. And this is why it's so important to study chimpanzees, because chimpanzees don't live in this social environment with moral norms and education, etc., and they don't have mothers who encourage them to act prosocially towards others. So this is why we tested chimpanzees, and in the first study we tested 3 nursery-reared chimpanzees from the Leipzig Zoo, and so this was the same study like with these 10 different helping situations in the 18-month-olds. And so here their caregiver was performing the same basic actions like out-of-reach tasks, using, in this case, a sponge to clean the table, and then dropped it on the ground accidentally and was reaching for it. To our surprise, we found that even these nursery-reared chimpanzees would help. They would help in these out-of-reach situations without being asked for help, without receiving a reward. And this was actually the first experimental evidence for helping in chimpanzees. But the problem with this study was, of course, that we tested a very special relationship. This was between human-reared chimpanzees, and the helpee was their caregiver. So even though she did not reward them and did not punish them if they didn't help, etc., maybe they expected negative consequences or positive consequences later on. So that's why we conducted this study that I presented, summarized before, with the 36 children also with 36 semi-free ranging chimpanzees who live in Uganda on Gamba Island. So this is one of the, unfortunately, very many sanctuaries that exist in Africa, mainly for chimpanzees and also bonobos, where they are brought after their parents have been killed, for example, in the bushmeat trade, or they have been kept as pets, and when they grow too old, as you've heard recently from Stanford, they are a problem, and then people just throw them out. So they live on this island, Ngamba Island, where they have a forest, and they can spend the day there, do their chimp thing, and then for the night they come to a human facility where they receive food and where they can sleep, etc. So they have exposure to humans, but they also have the living environment that is very similar to that we find in wild chimpanzees. And the other crucial feature of this study was that they were tested by an unfamiliar human experimenter, which is Brian Hare, my colleague, who set up this incredible network of sanctuaries to be tested. So he's at Duke University now, and I'll hopefully be able to continue to work with him on this. So we were able to test lots of chimps, so 36 chimps. It's not even possible in Leipzig. So, and we exposed them to the same basic tasks, and the reward in this case was a piece of banana. And the finding was that just like the children, the factor that determined their helping was whether the person was reaching for an object or not, and not whether they received a reward or not. So actually in an overall ANOVA in which we put this in, the only significant factor was that of reaching versus no reaching. So this shows that helping is not confined to human-reared chimpanzees. It extends also to semi-free ranging chimpanzees helping a stranger. Rewarding is not necessary, and also when we raised the cost for helping, namely they had to climb up into a raceway in order to retrieve the object for the other, they continued to help. So they are also willing to put a little bit of effort in their helping. So this is the finding that we have here. This is also important to point out that there was these different conclusions from our studies and the studies by Silk and Jensen, because they showed no positive evidence for helping. And until then, the problem was also that we showed positive evidence only for interactions of chimpanzees with humans, and they had chimp-chimp interactions and had negative findings. But another interpretation of this is that maybe the reason was that in these food donation behaviors or sharing behaviors that they use, or actually the task they used to elicit that, the problem or the desire of the recipient was not made clear. So one critical feature of these instrumental helping tasks is that the person is indicating that is doing something, and the problem becomes maybe more visible, and then maybe we are more prone to act on behalf of the other. So this is why we created a situation in which we had a chimp-chimp interaction. And so what we exposed them to was that a recipient chimpanzee was here in the center room, and he or she was faced with the problem that when she was trying to open a sliding door, this wasn't possible because it was blocked by a chain with a peg that is stuck between the bars of the subject room. So in this case, the recipient is dependent upon the help from the subject, who's the only one who can release the chain. So to elicit this behavior, we put food in the target room in experimental condition and put food in the distractor room in a control condition, so that the recipient would go away from the target door and try to open this other one. But in this case, help was not possible because this chain was unreachable for either of the two chimpanzees. And the logic is, of course, that if their releasing of the chain has anything to do with the attempt to get at the food, they should do that more often in the experimental than in the control condition. So here's the setup. You see the recipient in the center room trying to open this door, blocked by the chain highlighted in white, and the subject will appear in a few seconds on the right. the finding was that, in fact, the chimpanzees were more likely to release the chain in an experimental condition than in a control condition. In addition, they were also more likely to do that than over a baseline condition in which no one else was around. And maybe another interesting finding here was that because we could not, of course, perfectly manipulate the recipient to go to the one door in the experimental and the other door in the control condition. When we looked at their actual behavior, this correlated highly with the helping behavior. So namely in the control condition, and this partly explains why this is not zero, the recipient after some time, although he wasn't supposed to, approached the target door. And so in these cases, it was more likely that it would release that. And also another thing is we measured the amount of chain movement, and that had no predictive value, actually a negative correlation with their tendency to help. So this shows that chimpanzees help others in a novel situation as well. So chimpanzees help not only humans, they help also other conspecifics. And I just want to briefly mention that Alicia Miles, who was also a co-author on the previous study, she was able to replicate this finding, and she did an additional twist, gave a little twist to that, in that she had an exposure phase during which one of the chimps was either nice, would open the door for the other, or was mean, was opening the door for himself and entering the room and stealing the food. And then when roles were switched, there was some tendency, that was not significant, that they were more likely to help the nice stooge. They were more likely, at least in comparison to a control condition in which no one else was around. But the critical question is, of course, the difference between mean stooge and nice stooge. So there's not a very strong effect, but that actually reflects what we also find in the wild. So it shows a weak effect of contingent reciprocity, and so this is still an open question to what extent, in addition to being spontaneous, this helping behavior can modulate it based upon reciprocal altruism. So let me conclude. So these studies on young children show that their social cognitive understanding to infer other people's goals, together with their possibly altruistic motivation, enables acts of helping, and this propensity emerges very early in childhood. But we are not unique in this regard. It seems like crucial aspects of altruism are also present in chimpanzees, and therefore maybe in our common ancestor, and this would indicate that culture is not the only source of these behaviors. Obviously, culture can potentially facilitate these basic forms of altruism, and maybe human altruism is different because we have other techniques to make this bigger and broader, etc. But it seems like culture cultivates rather than implants the propensity to act altruistically in the human psyche. So I want to thank my collaborators, Alicia Miles, Brian Hare, Daniel Hanus, and Michael Tomasello, who worked on all these studies with me. And then we have a bunch of people in the Child Lab who not only run the studies, but are very innovative in creating all these tasks. Then, of course, the people in the primate centers in Leipzig, and especially the Gamba Island staff. And thank you for your attention. Bill?
Yes. In your data with children across the different venues, there was one reversal with caps. You didn't mention that.
Yeah, that's right. So in this task, I just had a baseball cap that I tried to put on, and it dropped on the ground. And in this case, there is just no significant difference between, but it's also not significant in the, but it's true, like the sheer numbers are reversed. And so I don't know why that is. It's possible because, possibly because this is the only task of these out of reach tasks where the problem is not part of a real action. Before it was always I put clothespins and do that and do that, and then suddenly the accident occurs. And then the baseball cap task, the thing just drops on the ground, and that was it. So maybe it's necessary that it's part of more complex action.
Thanks for a great talk. So in the videos, I couldn't help but notice that you said, oh, you know, when something happened. And I'm assuming that you didn't say that in the control condition, right? So, oh, I dropped this, or oh.
Right.
And I just wondered if you thought that the kids interpreted that as that you were in distress or that you were asking for help. Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah.
How they were interpreting that?
Right. I mean, this is true that there's several differences between the experimental and control conditions. So this in the experimental conditions, usually something like an accident that was involved, but not in all conditions, not in all of these tasks. So we don't know exactly what drives it, but we have also now studies where these cues are very minimal, and maybe sometimes the children don't even see the thing dropping, just see the other person reaching for it, and then they help. So there's a variety of cues that they can pick up on, and they help. And it's also interesting that when we invited children again who had previously helped, they didn't need these cues anymore. So the facial cues, etc., it was just they were able to read it from the situation itself to help the other. And then you also implied that there was maybe some distress cues or something. That is true. This is part of the problem. I mean, of the problem situation, that you're not pleased with what happened, but it's at a fairly minimal level. So this is not comparable to what is usually been done in these empathy situations, where a person is crying and the face is hidden and so forth. So there maybe it's a quantitative difference, but it would be a huge quantitative difference with regard to the distress cues that are provided.
But it suggests that kids could be just so sensitive that they only, to the emotions of others, that they only need that minimal cue. That's
possible, yeah. That's true. I mean, that would be important to maybe disentangle that. So Bischof Köhler actually distinguishes situation-specific cues from facial cues. And so she has never really disentangled that, but that would be some important, and the claim is also that these situational cues are something that indicates more the sympathy part and not so much the empathy or empathic responsiveness.
Play this out a little bit more. I mean, the culture, your reference was to human culture being unnecessary for altruism. But in fact, the chimpanzees live in a culture, the humans live in a culture. It's a different culture, obviously, but in both cases, those cultures encourage connectedness, relationships. And so is it really a propensity to altruism, or is it a propensity to behaviors of a variety of sorts simply on the basis of one chimp interacting with another chimp or a human being? Isn't there a reward simply in connecting to another being?
That is possible, and it's certainly the case. I mean, these are very social beings, so gregariousness is an important thing. And I guess that the social connectedness is something that they have to experience before they would do that. But it doesn't seem to be that this is something, a socialization practice, and that is specific for these behaviors. So I think this is something that is just evolving as just a general social interaction thing, but not something where specific behaviors are trained.
Right.
So that would be the thing. And and that they get some self-reward out of this when the other person is achieving the goal, etc. That's very possible. And I think, to some sense, it has to happen. That this must be the case. So Frans de Waal, whatever, I will not say how much I like his interpretations of these anecdotes, but I think he makes very important conceptual distinctions, and there he also says that maybe this is what drives it, that it's rewarding for you to see the other one relief in these empathy situations or achieve a goal in what he calls
with the book stacking. The little boy smiled every time, or he was getting kind of bored with you and thinking that you were clueless about stacking books. But the first 2 or 3 times that he fixed it, he smiled at you.
Yeah. Well, who doesn't?
No, but it was obviously he enjoyed it.
Yeah, okay.
He enjoyed helping you.
That's right, yeah.
There was a reward for him. I'm presuming that that's a registration of some good feeling that he had as a result of stacking your books for him.
I guess so, yeah. But it's true. I mean, we haven't analyzed it yet, but maybe we should do that in more detail and look at the facial expressions after the helping act.
Thank you again. Okay, our second speaker is Owen Flanagan, who is a philosopher from Duke. And in reading some of his literature, specifically The Bodhisattva's Brain and The Really Hard Problem, a couple of books, what I wanted to just mention is that he clearly has, his compassion altruistic act here is to identify some of our assumptions and to perhaps challenge them and make us think more clearly and harder about the assumptions that underlie altruism, empathy, compassion. So here we go.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here. I have some friends in this room who I have had conversations with going back about 9 or 10 years, and it's nice to be back. So my job as a philosopher is, my job description hasn't changed for 2,500 years, is to play gadfly. So someone asked me what I was doing this week. I said I'm going around some goody two-shoes psychologists mostly, and they're going to all be telling me how wonderful compassion is and altruism. So I have to give the reply. So my title is Compassion Overrated? Of course, my job again is to say yes, but now how to do that exactly, I'm not sure. What I'm going to do actually is start out by saying something anecdotal, which though may resonate with some of the psychologists in the audience who've been around a while, and will explain the thrust of my comments. I think of socio-moral competence generally as one of the many things about which there's lots of options about how we create ourselves, and we do them in community. We do this in communities. So one of the things I want to talk about is that some people have talked about. We've been talking about brain locations for various moral emotions. We've been talking about the behaviors that result from certain kinds of feelings, competencies, whatever. And there's been a discussion about that the payoff of at least things like compassion or altruism is in the behavior. And I think that's widely shared within philosophical traditions. And the question is, how best do we generate agents who are socio-morally competent and comfortable in their bodies and in their worlds? Given that worlds differ, I've been thinking about ethics as a form of human ecology for a long time. It's a metaphor I use, just to think about it as the way in which humans develop certain kinds of competencies that are suited, we hope, to our world and to cooperation, to improving condition of each other. But the anecdote is just this. When I went to graduate school in the 1970s, during that decade, pretty much, there weren't ethics courses being held because most philosophers were saying that A.J. Ayer had shown in 1954 that ethics was not intellectually respectable. It was just a lot of hurraying and booing for your team. Now, that was a dominant way of thinking long before I had gotten to graduate school, but it had it had gotten around to curriculums in philosophy PhD programs. So we did, though, study the history of ethics because that was curious. Why would people have such silly things as ethical views and ethical attitudes? There was, though, a small group of people, and John Rawls wrote his famous book, which I'll talk about, Theory of Justice, in a minute, published it in 1971. That made some people think the following. Maybe ethics isn't just a lot of hurraying and booing for your own team. Maybe there's something cognitively worthy about it. But clearly, if there is, it has to do with teaching people to absorb the right cognitive rule. Now, this goes back to what Alistair McIntyre calls the project of the Enlightenment. What are we going to do in Europe when all of a sudden there's all these different religious and ethical allegiances of different people? Aha! Answer, come up with a general purpose rule that all people can follow regardless of where they're coming from socially, religiously, or whatever. So what were the two contender rules? One was the categorical imperative. If you're German, there are a lot of Germans in this room, maybe they all were influenced by Kant, right? Well, if you're British, Australian, or American, you would like John Stuart Mill's answer to this question, which is act always so that you could, your action produces the greatest amount of good consequences for everyone, consequentialism or utilitarianism. But the idea was you don't have to consult any little local social practices. Those will just confuse you. Those are parochial, those are in-group stuff. Find the rule and follow it, the utilitarian calculus, the hedonic calculus. In Germany, of course, we get the idea that no, you should follow the categorical imperative. Act always so that the maxim by which you act could be made a universal law of nature. Now, Lawrence Kohlberg in psychology followed this idea, and he in fact called virtue theories he called them bag of virtue theories, and they were about level 3 in his 6-level hierarchy. So Kant and Mill were at the top, Aristotle, Confucius, Buddha, 3. I start with that thought. Okay. Now, you'll see how that relates here. So what I'm going to suggest to you today is what we're seeing across the social sciences and also in philosophy is a revival of virtue ethical theories. So I'm going to say a little bit about how virtue theories operate and ask you to reflect on them. And I'm going to do it in terms of something which the cognitive scientists in the room will be familiar with, although I'm not going to be committed to this actual idea myself today. But it's the idea of the modularity of mind. So Jerry Fodor in 1981 wrote a book, influential book called The Modularity of the Mind. And Fodor's idea was simply this. Let's think about minds. Let's think about the 5 senses. I'll just use that as my example. So Fodor's idea was the 5 senses. The eyes detect light. They can't detect sound. The ears detect sound. They can't detect light. Now, clearly, the information from these encapsulated, quick-acting, automatic systems comes together. So we move around in space, we negotiate the external world, but our 5 senses operate autonomously in some sense. Now they interpenetrate, as I've said, but they are cognitively impenetrable, he said, from the top. Now, what all that means is this: if I open my eyes, I'm going to see what's there. I can will to close my eyes, but if I can't open my eyes and will not to see what's in front of me. Okay, they're cognitively impenetrable in that sense, or they seem to be. Now, I raise some of these issues because there are traditions which argue that you can penetrate into systems which are even automatic. So that's why I'm not going to be abiding a very powerful modularity thesis. I'm not going to try to argue that virtue theories are committed to absolute distinctness of virtues, but I think they sort of are, and I want to push that a little bit today. So that the idea would be you could have some virtues and lack others. Compassion, if it's a virtue, you could have that, but you might not be very just or fair. That's a possibility I want to throw out to you. Okay, what I'm going to call Darwinian modules today are just Fodorian modules, but they're very effectively loaded. Now, the reason that's important is that in our discussions today so far, many people have been emphasizing, and this is the rage now, the importance of emotions. Again, this is sentimentalism is back in. The emotions, affect are very, very important. Okay, that's called Scottish sentimentalism. That was the view. Okay, so here are some hypotheses that are testable, and some of you actually have been testing them. We were talking about them today. This is Mencius. Mencius plays to Confucius the role Aristotle plays to Plato. The interesting thing about studying comparative philosophy, as I often do, is that you just get a sense of, like, this helps wonder, like, what's in these wisdom traditions? Do they hit upon the same sort of observations? The good thing about Chinese philosophy, unlike Buddhist philosophy, is we know for sure that the Chinese 2,500 years ago were not interacting with anybody from the Mediterranean world. It's not clear about, we have experts in this room who are nodding in agreement that. Okay, so this is Mencius, and listen to this. Humans all have hearts that are not unfeeling towards others. Suppose someone suddenly saw a child about to fall in a well. Everyone, even Hitler, in such a situation would have a feeling of alarm and compassion. And now, just what Felix was talking about, not because one sought to get in good with the child's parents, not because one wanted fame among their neighbors and friends, and not because one would dislike the sounds of the child's cries. From this we can see that if one is without the heart of compassion, one is not human. Now, the heart of compassion in Mencius is a sprout. So this is a nativist hypothesis. He thinks that there's a seed in each and every one of us. Now, they're going to be normal phenotypic variation. There'd be a psychopath who's not going to have this. Don't tell me that. But I mean, that's true. He'll have to accept that. And he goes on, and this is 2A6. So this is Mencius' famous 4-sprout view. And he says this: if one is without the heart of deference, so he goes on now from compassion. What's deference? It's the kind of behavior that a cub wolf will show to a dominant wolf if they're getting into a fight. It'll eventually defer rather than get its neck broken. Deference. Important for Chinese ethics, right? That sprout. Because shao, which is filial piety, being respectful towards elders, is a really important virtue for this tradition. The heart of disdain, shame, and disgust is the sprout of righteousness. Now, disgust has been coming up in this conference, but it hasn't been talked about enough, because you'll see in some of the research I'll get to in a minute. The heart of deference is the sprout of propriety. The heart of approval and disapproval is the sprout of wisdom. Now, notice what he says here. This is like kind of what I sometimes call the put, water and sun. People having these 4 sprouts is like they're having 4 limbs. Then, without realizing it, one's feet begin to step in time to them, and one's hands dance according to their rhythms. So this is the kind of just take human nature as it is, put us out in a normal environment, and virtue will grow. There's 4 seeds in us. They're autonomous. They're for different plants, and they grow into different virtues. So compassion grows into ren in the Chinese tradition, which would be their word for benevolence. It would be translated as benevolence. Compassion is the root of it. It's the emotional root. It has an action tendency associated with it. And then you water it, and you grow it, and you tell the kid, don't be mean to your sister like that, share, and that attaches the kind of compassion to then relations with your sister. Okay, now this is what I call mention moral modularity, okay? And let's go on. Okay, so this is both a descriptive thesis and a normative thesis. And one of the things I want to have you think about today is this. What is the right way to grow moral seeds if there are moral seeds in us? Or if you take the Buddhist tradition, which is not quite botanical, there are some good seeds in us, but there are some poisons in us, right? Should you exterminate the poisons? Should you keep them to a minimum? If you exterminate them, do you ruin some of the other stuff in the garden? These are complicated, very complicated questions about normativity. But if you take the mention view, you can see it's fairly straightforward. There's a descriptive view. We have 4 seeds that will grow, will secure our moral competence, and it's simple to do so. Socio-moral excellence just involves growing them to maturity, and it will happen, after all. Your arms and legs will grow. Now, because I'm a Darwinist, you can put this into Darwinian terms. Evolution settled on a 4-leg, 4-limb design because it was an adaptation. That is, at the time it evolved in ancestral species. That's what I mean by adaptation historical. It's still adaptive. That is, it's an adaptation in the current ecology. This is always a question to be asked about any trait which is ancient, and especially if it developed in other species than ourselves, right? It could have been an adaptation at the time it evolved. We don't know if it's an adaptation still. So, for example, wanting to fight over my mate, over jealousy, might be adaptive when all I could do was chase after you with sticks and stones. It's less clear that it's an adaptive trait in a world in which there are weapons that one has easy access to. It emerges in a naturally in a universal species-specific way across ecologies, and thus humans ought to grow their legs in the way nature designed them to grow. That seems obvious. Why should a philosopher state it? Well, it's to show this. There's another argument which you can't get put through. David Hume talks about these kind of problems. Evolution settled on 4 moral seeds because they were adaptations. Good. They're still adaptations. Compassion's good to grow. The seeds emerge and grow and are tuned in roughly the same way across all natural and social ecologies. Therefore, we ought to grow the seeds the way Mother Nature designed them to grow. But 3 is false. They're just not grown the same ways across social ecologies. So the question comes back, what's the right way to grow these seeds? Now, one idea I suggest that you might want to think about is what I'm suggesting today would be something like this, that you might think of socio-moral competence as involving, as I said at the beginning, just learning the right rule, one rule. Or you might think of it as growing one sprout, like become a compassionate person and everything will be taken care of. The possibility suggested by these sprout-type views is, no, you may need all of them up and running. On that view, morality would be more like a decathlon or a pentathlon, maybe, depending on how many sprouts there are, or a Swiss Army knife. See, the idea would be seriously that, so a decathlon is 10 events. Some of them are throwing events, right? Discus, hammer, I don't know what else, javelin. Some of them are running events, sprinting, long distance running. Just suppose that being a compassionate person doesn't have that much, although we just heard some evidence about this, carry over to being a just or fair person. Suppose. Could there be evidence of this? I claim there is evidence of this. Okay, so now we move up from 2,600 years ago to contemporary times, and this is a view. I predicted that this view would be out there, and it is now, and it's some of you may know John Haidt's work, but a lot of people are pushing this kind of view. Richard Schwader, a cultural psychologist, but it's popular now among a bunch of people. So if you look at this, so the current suggestion of people working in this field is that if you look cross-culturally, like look at wisdom traditions, look at what great ethical theories, the great wisdom traditions there say, do cross-cultural anthropological work, and basically just pay attention to all the different data sources. If you do, you'll see that these 5 zones of life are moralized across many different cultures, okay? So there'll be this. So notice, for our purposes, harm care, okay, that's what we've mostly been talking about today. So notice, so this would be, what's the adaptive challenge that we first, that this zone was for? Well, we need to be compassionate to protect and care for our young, for vulnerable others, and for our kin. The proper domain, therefore, is suffering and distress or threat to one's kin. Okay, and the characteristic emotion is compassion. Notice, okay? So the compassion is linked up with this one. So if you want to grow your responsivity to this zone of life, that is, if you want to pay attention and have expertise in doing well in this zone, grow compassion. What are the relevant vice here? Would be cruelty or something like that. Maybe schadenfreude, which could be overcome by this. But notice, next to this, we have fairness and reciprocity. And here, this is a lot of evolutionary game theorists in on this, the adaptive challenge is to reap benefits of dyadic cooperation with non-kin. Okay, well, I'll talk about some experiments of this in a second. And the proper domain is, you know, kind of ultimatum type games, things like that. Where, and then you see down here, what are the characteristic emotions? Anger, gratitude, guilt. Okay, I'm not going to go through all these, but I just want to show you that. So growing compassion, if this picture is remotely right, growing compassion will get you really good at this. But the question is, if these are relatively autonomous, does it get you good at them? So justice is fairness. Then there's in-group loyalty, and that's to reap the benefits of group cooperation. So if you just do this, if you grow this a lot, maybe you're not going to be that good at reaping the benefits of group cooperation, which you need sports teams for or something like that. Okay, anyway, you get the picture here. Authority, respect, this is a huge area in Chinese philosophy, in Confucianism, Shao, filial piety, Li, all kinds of respect rituals for the elders, and so on and so forth. And actually what John Haidt has told me, he thinks that this one is the most important and most universal, purity and sanctity, the moralization of, that starts with moralization of sexual habits related to waste products, diseased people, and carries over to, and the disgust response plays an important role. And you can see there, it's tied in a lot with sexual behaviors. So some of you will know the Brosnan and Duvall paper that was in, where is it, in Science or Nature? I'll get to it on the next page. This is a paper done with monkeys, yeah, Capuchin monkeys, in a neuroeconomics game. So you have 2 capuchins in front of you. I give them each, I think it was, we'll say, a cucumber. They're not that interested in cucumbers, but they'll eat them. You give them cucumbers, but they watch each other, right? And then I switch out. I give this one a kiwi, and then this one a cucumber. And in no time, the one who got the cucumber is still getting the cucumber will start to throw dirt at me, curse me out in monkey, you know. So it escalates right away to a hostile, angry response to my not any longer treating the capuchins fairly. Now you might just say to yourself, well, I ask you this, could you tell a story that's plausible about how compassion is involved in that situation? I claim you could tell one, but it's not going to be very plausible. This is about a different psychological mechanism, about a different domain of life. The people who are speaking about compassion right now are on the right in America. So think of Bobby Jindal's speech the other day. It was all about how you don't want to trust big government to do things. You want to trust the compassionate stuff that those people in Louisiana were able to do during the hurricane. It was very, very important to his message. Okay? What you get among what you're seeing now is a return in the Democratic Party to a certain kind of talk that's from the American liberal tradition that talks about justice as fairness. It doesn't talk about what kind of responses emotionally or compassion. It's not using that language. Now that to me is interesting in its own right. So Rawls, in his, John Rawls, of course you know, is the most important political philosopher in the 20th century. And in his book, The Theory of Justice, he suggests that in asking the question, what kind of society do we want to live in, he suggests the thought experiment. Put yourself behind the veil of ignorance into the original position. It's a thought experiment. Assume people are moderately risk averse, but they don't know what world they're going to be born into. I don't know whether I'll be gifted with intelligence. I don't know if I'll have physical gifts. I don't know if I'll be good looking or bad looking. I don't know any of these things. Rawls says, in that situation where you're moderately risk averse, everyone will choose these two principles. First, I'll choose a principle that I want to be able to do what a person like me will want to do once I get out. I want to be free to do that unless it interferes with your liberty. And the second principle is the different principle. Social and economic inequality should be arranged so that they are to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged persons and attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of equality of opportunity. So this is the idea behind the welfare state. And Rawls would say things like the only countries that really instantiate this view that we have are, Sweden and Northern European countries. But the idea, I think this is important, is that the idea behind liberalism is don't worry about upping the ante on individual compassion and fellow feeling. Up it on the infrastructure of a society. Do things like take morality out of the hands of people in the following sense. You have to have it locally and within the family, but have the society do it by, for example, high tax rates, progressive taxation. Okay? And I think this is, so I think what sometimes is going on in our discussions is we forget about other ways to build these same things. I asked Paul Ekman this morning, I think many of you were here, are there different ways that you could come to have this sort of same response? He was talking about Christian rescuers of Jews during the Holocaust, and his answer was yes. And so I'm suggesting now you might be able to build good people in different ways that don't just depend on their individual psychology. Okay, I'm almost to the end. Okay, if Mencius was right, or if the 21st century version of, which I call SIM, that's social intuitionist modularity, those 5 modules. And could there be more modules? Sure. And is modules the right way to talk? I said I'm not sure about it. But the reason I like it is because it does map onto virtue theory as well, because virtues are special purpose competencies. A courageous person might be lacking in all the other virtues. Okay. Now, you should see them in all different traditions. Now, what Haidt and his colleagues have said in some of their papers, going back to their list, if I go back to this list, their claim is that an easy way to explain the moral disagreement in, for example, America is as follows. Liberals only moralize 2 areas on that list to a significant degree, the first 2, right? Compassion and justice. Conservatives moralize all 5. I don't know to what degree. This is not a claim I'm making. I mean, it's an observation, and they're making it, okay? So the idea is, what is the moral conflict between liberals and conservatives come to? His idea is that what the socializers of the liberals are doing is watering those seeds that up the ante on those first 2, and what the socializers of the conservatives are doing is watering all seeds, and they have a garden that looks differently. That's kind of interesting, but then it leaves open the following question. What's the right way? What's the right way to do it? You see, you'd like to know that question, and we all have strong feelings about it. I have very strong feelings about this. Okay, but then the question is, well, what would be one's evidence for that feeling? And, so this is the problem. Okay, let me just go on. And this was my suggestion because there's a lot of Buddhist love affair going on here today, so I want to suggest something else here. This is just a thought I've had. If you look at the 4 illimitable, inelimitable, whatever we call these are the super duper. If you're a bodhisattva, you want to develop these more than anything else. Compassion, the desire to alleviate suffering for all sentient beings. Loving kindness, metta, the desire to bring happiness to all sentient beings in its stead. Mudita, being happy for others in zero-sum games where you've lost. And equanimity. Equanimity I'm just going to leave aside because it's very complicated. But make-believe equanimity just has to do, although it doesn't, with being serene or calm, make-believe. The other three are all versions of compassion, I claim. And so one suggestion might be that Buddhism is a good example of the hypertrophy of the compassion module. Is it a good idea to grow hypertrophically the compassion module? I don't know. It depends on what morality is for. What is it for? If it's to sort of keep doing what one tradition did before, then you could say, well, that's what our tradition calls upon us to do. But the liberal tradition will call upon you to do something else. It'll say the biggest problem is that we reward luck by letting rich people get richer and poor people get poorer. You don't have to be compassionate to notice that is a metaphysical sort of problem. Change it. So there are very different attitudes we can take here. Okay, I can't do this, so, oh, I know. So question is, what follows from this? Well, first of all, you might just be, hopefully you go back to the drawing, we all go back to the drawing board and continue to ask that question. What exactly do we want to build any traits of character for in our charges, in the youth, in the next generation? What are they good for? This is a question about what kind of world we want. It's not just about what kind of individual psychology we want. What is ethics for? What kind of world do we want to end up with? Some people have suggested that to me when I've given some versions of this talk, well, what it shows is that we should just be understanding and tolerant of all the different ways that people are. Maybe, but maybe not. Most people don't like that when it comes to morality. Okay, we have very, very proprietary views about the rightness or wrongness, especially of our substantive convictions about things. In any case, well, there's some other skeptical conclusions, but I won't draw your attention to them now. I'll just open it up. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the very thought-provoking presentation. I think there is definitely something in the moral modularity model that you have just presented, but I'm wondering whether you present it as if it's either or scenario, and I don't know whether that really kind of captures the kind of the tension you are trying to get at. For example, if you look at Buddhist ethics, which is Shila, and ethics is really understood in a kind of a contextual way. So it's no one universal ethics as such. Right. And what constitutes an ethical behavior really is contingent upon the context in which you are in. So what may be an ethical action for an ordinary person may be unethical for someone who is supposed to be a bodhisattva. So it's that is there. And secondly, taking compassion as the foundation of ethics, you don't necessarily preclude the recognition of other ethical faculties like sense of fairness, justice, and we all know that some form of golden rule is implicit in all moral systems. And if you look at the golden rule, a kind of recognition of a sense of fairness is there. And so, for example, if you look at the Buddhist ethics, avoidance of harm is the fundamental principle. Right. And how the avoidance of harm principle gets translated in different contexts is different matters. So on the basic level, if you look at the actual content of the ethical actions, there's a large convergence, sense of fairness as much as compassion and avoidance of harm. They're all there. So I don't know whether the modularity model that you presented really need to be, if one subscribes to this, does one really need to take it as each touching upon an independent faculty that unless you cultivate it somehow doesn't get developed, or whether there is a way in which you don't need to look at the modularity, but in the process of living an ethical life these different aspects get developed. So I'm just pointing this out.
Yeah, several different things. Yeah, all virtue theories do tend to be context very sensitive, so that'll be an advantage of any virtue theory that you see, I think, whether it's Aristotelian, Confucian, or Buddhist. I have been looking for a long time on sort of when I list the virtues, so of Plato, of Aristotle, of Confucius, of Mencius, of various Indian thinkers. Something in the vicinity of compassion appears on most of them. The development of justice as a virtue is relatively late, and you see it in Greece, though, long before you see it in the other traditions, it seems like. So my point is about an emphasis. And
yeah, but I mean, wouldn't the whole principle behind, whether or not it is thematized and, you know, kind of articulated, the whole principle behind the golden rule is a sense of fairness. You treat others in the way in which you want others to treat
No, I totally agree with that about the golden rule.
But I mean, wouldn't fairness be a rudimentary form of justice?
Yes, no, justice is, right. Justice and fairness are together. No, I'm not denying that. I mean, my only theme for today was really that if we moved away from rule-based theories back into this vicinity we're in now, with most people thinking that what morality is about is the building of some kind of competencies that usually involve some emotional activation. So I go back to, I guess Paul's not here. So, you know, one of Paul's great discoveries that got me interested in philosophy of mind, actually, was noticing that there are very specific physiological profiles of the basic emotions. So one idea here, but we see it also in Hume and other people's sentimentalist tradition, is that the body is doing very specific things in response to different environmental triggers, okay? So just as the animal at the campfire that makes you scared, being scared is a very, very specific thing, so too the feeling of alarm for the child falling in a well is a very specific thing. Take that, the social community should take that and run with it. All I'm emphasizing is that different communities do differ in what they moralize about. That's really all, the only lesson for today. And that these things are interpenetrating. That's what, you know, John Dewey had this nice idea about virtue theories. He said, morality is the interpenetration of virtues. So they're definitely interpenetrating. But one idea I have here is just, if you look at them down below, what are they rooted in?
To Jimper's point, I'm actually really thinking about exactly the same issue. Are they codependent or not? And I think actually from game theory, you could probably predict that they're really opposite. For example, if you have a very strong fairness-based judgment, what you usually observe is when fairness is violated, people get angry, or they punish. They engage in punishment, or, you know, anger-driven or not. I mean, that's a discussion, but at least if you have compassion-based motivation, you should not, because you should actually feel compassion to the victim and to the perpetrator of unfair actions. So you would not engage probably, or that would not be the first prediction, I think, of a compassion training. So I think in that, I mean, just it's perhaps a bit of an artificial situation, but they would actually contradict each other in how you would react to violation of fairness.
The finding, by the way, again and again about the purity violation. So Lord Patrick Devlin, in 1957, wrote a famous book called The Enforcement of Morals, and his argument was that that homosexuality should not be decriminalized in Britain because the man on the Clapham omnibus would have powerful feelings of intolerance, indignation, and disgust towards homosexuals. And you could imagine if you asked people, though, don't you feel sorry for them? He said, oh yeah, I feel compassion for them, but it's being overridden by disgust. So that would be what you'd predict, although Tanya and Richie today did present results that support the idea that the interpenetration works, because they both gave results about the way compassion and fairness work together. So I'm complete. Sometimes they don't, but I mean, so the interesting empirical questions, I mean, you know, because you're trained as an analytic philosopher too, we're supposed to make very, very precise distinctions, and then you're going to find out whether or not those distinctions sort of map onto the way the body and brain does it. John?
Could you go to your list of the sim virtues, the 21st century, wherever it was back there? Because I think that I'm going to say that in...
by the way, this is not mine, but this is the one I'm entertaining.
Right, yes. That from your idea of the hypertrophy of compassion actually is somewhat compelling. And I think the Buddhist position might actually be that most of the others are not adaptive anymore. And that I think in particular...
I didn't expect you to say the second part. I thought it was interesting if you say they would cop to the hypertrophy or thing, but go ahead.
No, I think that the others are not considered virtues, actually. Especially, I'm going to argue that fairness is not a bodhisattva virtue. And precisely for the reason that you're mentioning, and also in your little box there, that anger, fairness is is going to be invoked by, or is going to invoke anger.
Right.
And I mean, there are a number of texts. Now, how you want us to interpret these texts is another question, but just for an example, and in the famous text by Shantideva, The Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, it says that in sort of listing a series of aspirations that he has, he says, basically, may people treat me as unfairly as they want.
Right.
May they cover me with crap, literally, he says. May they play with my body. May they do whatever will make them happy. I don't care. So there's obviously no concern about maintaining some kind of fairness. Now, part of this in the Buddhist tradition is also that the universe in itself, mechanistically, will take care of that because of karma. And no one can escape that, so you don't actually there's no need to enforce fairness because it's built into the system.
Let's not go there, John. This is a scientific meeting.
Yeah, sorry. Just explaining.
The hypothesis.
Yeah. In other words, your conditioning will do you in the end. Yeah. But I think it's very interesting to consider the possibility that actually you're right, but the Buddhist response is that because the others are maladaptive.
Yeah. And I'm, at this point, as I said, I'm just suggesting entertaining this. I don't think there's any good, but it's interesting. It's an ancient idea. That's one thing I want you to see. It's a very ancient idea. We see, these three traditions are 2,500 years ago. Confucius beats them out by 100 years, Buddhism and Plato and Aristotle. But these are three independent traditions all coming up with articulation of virtue theories at the same time.
But if I could make one quick note, it also is important to note that Buddhism was not very successful in creating a polity around itself, except in Tibet. So that's another interesting point.
So Bill Newsome is an esteemed neuroscientist here, and I just want to make one in the spirit of how I've been introducing people, who not only does science, but is willing to really put himself into his own experiments. And I think that's actually, talk about, when we're talking about in the spirit of altruistic behavior, the idea that we as scientists not only will test others, but we would actually be willing to test our own brains. And that's a whole dimension that continues to reverberate in my mind, because I don't know how many people would actually do that. It's easier to stand back and observe than to be willing to step in. So.
Thank you, Phillipe. For those of you who don't know, Phillipe's referring, I'm on record actually, as saying that I would like to have my brain stimulated, because it's only by actually stimulating our brains in animals that can give verbal reports that we can actually get to a real science of consciousness, as opposed to writing lots of things about consciousness that aren't actually science. So I've tried to do that. I wouldn't say I've tried to do that. I've explored that possibility. I didn't plan on saying this when I came up there. This is all your fault.
I take it. It's my fault.
And, it comes back down to getting approvals from IRBs and human subjects committees and things like that. And, my response is I point out all the time that we pay young men and women to sit on top of Saturn V rockets and get shot into orbit. That's far more dangerous than having your brain stimulated, right? What's going on here? Anyway, that's not what I came up here to talk about. I'm tasked with discussing two very diverse talks, and there's a lot to admire in both of these. One of the things I admire most about Felix's talk is that he's actually trying to operationalize something about altruism. It's a very clear experimental paradigm and a very clear definition of helping behavior in response to reaches or not reaches, and giving rewards or not giving rewards. And he defines it as a spontaneous willingness to help another achieve a goal at a cost to the self and at a lack of reward. Owen's talk I thought was really nice, because he's one of these philosophers that I like Owen's as a philosopher, is because I come away from some philosophy talks thinking, what in the world did I understand from that? And too often the answer is not much, but with Owen I actually understand what he's saying, and I feel like it's intuitive and then it's clear. So I appreciate that. And Owen and Felix have common roots in viewing a lot of moral behavior in an evolutionary perspective, which I appreciate. And we come then to the point of talking. I just want to pursue one idea that's been laid down here today, and it's the idea about reward. And this has been mentioned several times today in the role of a structure called the nucleus accumbens that we know from animal experiments is very important in basic reward states like hunger, like thirst, like sex. And in I think a groundbreaking experiment that Brian Knudsen here did several years ago, he showed that humans in a scanner playing a monetary reward game, that just the work for money, which you might think would activate uniquely human structures, actually leads to activation of the nucleus accumbens. The exact same structure in animals that is involved in reward-seeking behavior for food and fluids and sex. And that, of course, raises the question of how high does this kind of thing go? So when we talk about Felix's experiments and we talk about roots of proto-altruism in chimps and 18-month-old humans, the question arises that Bill Mobley here actually asked was, but when I looked at that 18-month-old face, I actually saw he was pleased. You know, there was pleasure on that. And even though he wasn't getting an overt reward in the form of, you know, a toy or food or something like that, there seemed to be some kind of intrinsic reward going on. And you could easily imagine that that little human, that little 18-month-old, had an activation in the nucleus accumbens, or that the chimp had an activation in the nucleus accumbens, that there was a reward mechanism that somehow is driving the behavior in a way that's not linked to overt rewards, but there's somehow this intrinsic self-rewarding mechanism, intrinsic rewards. And Owen, in his write-up, his abstract for this conference, actually framed this. He asked a question that I thought was really well stated. He said, does self-reward, the phenomenon of self-reward, undermine the notion of altruism? Or is this a conceptual confusion? And that sounds like the kind of question a philosopher would ask. And I'm going to get out of the way in a minute and let him and Felix perhaps try to answer that question. And I think it's an important question. Why do I think it's important? Well, I can see a lot of my motivations as being driven by those low-level reward mechanisms. But there are certain kinds of behavior that we all engage in, like the value of education, how you work for an education for 4 years of an undergraduate, 5, 6, 7 years, whatever, of a graduate student, and how do you translate the value of an education and that motivated behavior into activation of a structure like the nucleus accumbens. It's not at all clear to me that you can do this, and there may be other reward circuits and other reward mechanisms in the brain. But if even those high-level behaviors, our pursuit of truth and our pursuit of beauty, comes back down in the end to those same common reward mechanisms like the accumbens and the dopamine system, does that matter to us? Does it matter for our conceptions of altruism or not? And I don't know. I can give you another example of one of these high-level behaviors. I recently finished serving as chair of my department for 3.5 years. And I'll tell you, I don't understand, I don't think that has any reward in it that even approaches the reward of a glass of wine or a good steak or something like that. Now, maybe it's down there deep somewhere, but boy, it'd be a lot more straightforward for me if it did touch my nucleus accumbens the way a glass of wine. I wish that it did that. To make this even a little bit more personal, perhaps at the risk of too much self-disclosure, I grew up in a part of the country and at a time where I absorbed very negative attitudes about race. I grew up in a society where racism was simply endemic. And it's been a long journey over the years to free myself of that and to reorient my behavior and my attitudes and my feelings to be rewarded by universal conceptions of humanhood and race, rather than by very parochial ones like the ones that I grew up with. And how did that happen? I mean, looking on it in retrospect, I think a lot of that initial development was cognitive. A lot of it was my parents trying to get rid of some of the more egregious racist aspects of the place that I grew up and teach my brothers and I that we were different somehow. Part of it was the church that I went to, and I had to grapple with that thing from Matthew that was quoted today by Dr. Farley. Or I was grappling with things from St. Paul, like, you know, where he says, in Christ, there is no Jew or Gentile, there is no male nor female, there is no slave or free. I had to grapple with that cognitively. I had to grapple with our national documents that say we take these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And I admire the Helsinki Declaration on Human Rights. And I changed cognitively toward a different value system and a cognitive judgment that this value system is better than the other value system. But now, many, many years later, oddly and perversely, I find easier to believe in a direct link to the nucleus accumbens at this point in time, because now I hear those things or I say those things and I actually have an emotional response. I have a tearing of the eye. When I see someone behave in a way that reflects those kinds of values, there's a locking of the gaze that can occasionally take place. You don't need to say anything, and you just know that you're on the same wavelength values-wise. And so to me, the emotional stuff came after, and the emotional reinforcement and the emotional allegiance to those values came after a long cognitive process. And I should also tell you, I had the first person of color in one of my school classes when I was in the 8th grade, and part of my development was making a racist remark in class with this one guy there, and the school teacher taking me out after class and telling me that wasn't going to happen in her classroom again. You know, so people make differences here. So this question, does it change how we think about altruism if those fundamental reward mechanisms are at play? And I'll stake out some turf here. I'll say personally no. If those higher level allegiances and values all link up ultimately to the same low level brain reward mechanisms like the nucleus accumbens, I don't really care. But you know, where the interplay is in which ideas get linked up to the nucleus accumbens. Is it ideas about universal personhood and equality or compassion, or is it ideas about one race being superior to others and being endowed with more rights than others? You know, and that's the wiggle room, right? That's the interplay where ideas somehow get hooked up to the reward mechanisms, and that's where we have the freedom. And I think we have the freedom there, and we have the responsibility there, and we have the chance for education there, irrespective of what the mechanisms are that actually generate reward. Now, if we believe that, it raises another question, which is, what is it that a neuroscientist actually has to contribute to a conversation like this? I mean, I've studied vision for a lot of my career, and I don't think it makes the world more full of vision and visionful. A lot of psychologists have studied memory, and I don't think they've created more or better memory in the world. And there's a question here about neuroscience. By studying compassion altruism, does neuroscience really have something to contribute here, or is the contribution really at the behavioral level? And that's perhaps a question that we should think about seriously, you know, tonight over dinner, over beer, or something like that. So I'll stop there, and I really want to return the focus. I'd like to return the focus back to Felix and Owen. First of all, with this question about, I mean, how do you guys think? And Bill started this conversation with Felix, and Felix responded, well, I haven't really looked at the facial expressions yet. Maybe there is an internal reward. And Felix, doesn't make any difference if there's an internal reward or not. And Owen, very provocative question that you asked about does this undermine the notion of altruism, or is it a conceptual confusion? Am I dawdling in this conceptual confusion? So I'd just like to see these guys respond some to this, and I'll sit down, and then we can throw it open for general discussion. You're in charge.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Well, I mean, one thing that we haven't touched on here is, and that's a very crucial distinction in biology, is that between proximate and ultimate mechanisms. And so when the question about rewards is about the proximate mechanisms, and it has no influence whatsoever on the question of the ultimate function of altruism. So whatever the underlying proximate mechanism might be, is this a reward, internal, external, is it socialization or whatever, has no effect on whether there's altruism in the evolutionary sense of ultimate fitness, costs to the actor and benefits to another. So that's something to keep in mind. Not that anybody said this, but I just want to say this because sometimes it's like that people say if there is a reward, intrinsic reward or something for the person, then it's not altruistic. That has no effect on the question of ultimate function. And I think that it's very likely, and in some sense it has to be the case, that it's intrinsically rewarding, because I mean any behavior, it can't be we can't be an unmoved mover somehow, right? We have to be motivated by something, and the critical question is if the self-reward goes via the other person's feelings, for example, or desires, low conative states in the case of this instrumental helping. And so only if my successful helping act defined by the other person achieving the goal is self-rewarding, then I would say this is altruistic. If it's only about doing this helping act and has nothing to do with my success, I mean, or with the other person's not suffering anymore, etc., then it would not be called altruistic in that sense.
I'll be very quick so that the audience gets at this. I think that Bill raises several related questions. One is a question that I see. Max Weber talked about the human sciences resulting in the disenchantment of the world. And I don't buy that, but I do hear it, that the more and more explanations are given in terms of whatever the explanation is. I mean, I am always amused by neuroscience. The Tuesday New York Times, reporting neurojournalism. Everything has to be called neuro something, right? And the idea that they say, such and such brain area found where something, such and such happens. And it says, and I think, well, why is this so interesting? Because it had to happen somewhere unless you had a Cartesian view of things. And I think it's the same idea about getting down to the mechanisms that some people do find that disturbing. And morality is easy, especially easy zone, because I think due to the legacy of the religious traditions that we come from, morality is supposed to be super duper and special, and it isn't. It's supposed to have transcendental sources. I mean, Kant famously distinguishes, he says an action doesn't have moral worth if you do it because you're emotionally inclined to do it. So taking care of your family, if you do it out of inclination, doesn't have moral worth. If you don't like them and take care of them, then it has moral worth. He's very, very clear about this. So this is a very, bizarre Protestant view. And I'm sorry, the Germans in the room. I really feel bad now. But I think that's where this. So the idea is that, gee, if morality is it has some function. I often think that one way to think about morality is to think about it like engineering. Why do we want to build that bridge? It's costly. Well, it's because it's a good idea. If it's a bridge to nowhere, it's not a good idea. If it's a moral thingamajig for no other reason that they used to have that and it's fun to get it back, then we don't need it either. But I think I find again and again that thinking about morality in any way as an instrumentally useful thing gives certain people the heebie-jeebies, and I think that's just their problem, not ours. Thank you.
Right. So first of all, I really enjoyed this session. Very, very provocative. So the question for Felix or Owen or Bill or anyone is why extrinsic reward diminishes intrinsic motivation when it should reinforce it.
The common view there is that the act becomes instrumental. So I'm not helping anymore because it is self-rewarding, but I'm doing that in order to get a reward. And when the reward is no longer forthcoming, there's no reason for me to act in this way anymore.
So the behavioral modification is so overwhelming that it surpasses any intrinsic systems that have developed.
Right. That would be, yeah. And this has been shown in many different areas. So in schooling, this is an important, and with adults, and in prosocial behavior, also with older children. Richard Phapes has a study on that. So there is evidence that this is happening. But what's important to point out is these external rewards are detrimental if there is an intrinsic motivation in the first place. So, I mean, so if there's no intrinsic motivation to do that, then external rewards might actually be the way to go. So, but the question there is still how long-lasting that would be.
I think one reason here is that we need the strong intrinsic reward systems, those strongly developed things, because we get put in social situations where we're going to get extrinsic rewards for doing really bad things. So these are, very famous experiments done here at Stanford and under different social systems, and we're all enmeshed in those social systems. I mean, you can't grow up American these days without being deeply corrupted by materialist ideology. You just can't do it. And those strong internal reward systems and strong internal notions are what are essential to fight against the extrinsic reward systems that are set up and cannot be relied on to be good.
For me, you were conflating two things. You talked about the interdependence of virtues, which makes a lot of sense to me. In the tradition, the parts of the Christian tradition I know about, that interdependence is really important. And I agree. I feel very strongly, actually, that compassion by itself can have a damaging effect. It needs some other kinds of, like wisdom or whatever. But to me, there was that question about the interdependence of virtues. That part made sense to me. The part that I was wanted to ask you about was that your particular virtues, your grid, looked to me like it was normalizing what I take to be oppressive power structures, which has to do, I think, with these comments. You know, the way we get rewarded in that part of your brain that he was talking about for really horrific things. And your virtues seem to me to reinforce that rather than challenge that. Because they are called ethics when they're actually normalizing domination.
Okay. Actually, I discussed that on the last page, but I wanted to stop because this is a serious problem about most morality is just conventionalism. So I think I say here, I'm not going to read it myself, but these are just zones of moralization. Mm-hmm. So then the question is, well, what does that prove? Just that people moralize doesn't tell us whether or not it's appropriate moralizing. I totally agree. This is the old problem. You know, in Book 1 of Plato's Republic, he says, Thrasymachus gives him the challenge. He says, what morality is whatever the people in power say it is. No, I totally agree with that. And that's the problem, you see, because it's a very serious problem about moral relativism. So explain to me, so those people got power, what's wrong with that? No, I'm not defending it, but the idea is just that if you look over the world, you'll see, so many people will say this about the Confucian tradition, that it grows that Li and that Shao, that the rights and the piety, to a very perplexing point where you get people who are not free thinkers. So there's criticisms made, and you'll often hear, I know all political philosophers I know say, oh my God, don't talk to me about Buddhism and don't talk to me about Confucianism. They never heard about justice. Really, the idea is that this is a complete missing thing, and justice is the most important virtue, despite there would be a response. Jimpa could still say, but isn't that what the golden rule is about? Well, maybe, but if you look at the texture of all the tradition, it doesn't seem that there is a lot of emphasis on that. But I totally agree. Yeah.
So it's interesting because I think one of the presuppositions that the chart that you presented made is that these things have evolved because they are adaptive. And I don't know that that's actually true, because it suggests that it's selection pressure that drove the evolution of morality or these ethics across these cultures. And the problem is that as monkeys go, we're really, really smart. And so we can cause an artificial relaxation of selection pressure at a certain threshold. And it may be that what's principally ordering our behavior at that threshold is different than protecting our genes. And as evidence of that, I would ask, how many people here have more than 2 children in this room? Could you raise your hand? Okay, so not many of us, and we're all at sort of childbearing age, as far as, or past that in Bill's case. but what I but you know, it's interesting because if this was really just about, you know, dinging the evolutionary chalkboard, we would all be in big trouble, right? So there's this question of why is it that has been flipped on its head? But it raises a much more troubling question, which is, if it is not evolution that is driving this, then what is? And I think that this is terrifying in some sense, because I think that at some point, the point that you've made is that it's kind of arbitrary, right? I mean, it may be that what's actually driving this is us. And in answer to your question, John, what does a flower mean? Well, I guess it depends on the day. If it's Valentine's, it means one thing. And if it's a funeral, it means something else. But what's true in either case is that it is part of an enmeshed, complex hermeneutic circle in which we are all participating, right? And as we sort of participate, it somehow evolves and changes with us. And we do contribute at that level, right, where we are interfacing with a flower, and somewhere in our head something is going on. But it's just as true that is intercalated inextricably with the system that surrounds it. And so I guess that in some sense this is kind of terrifying, because here we are with all these powers to destroy ourselves now, and here we're sort of looking at these questions, and this then is the crux of the question, the heart and soul of this research, is what do we do now?
So maybe we can let Jim Doty answer that question. What are we going to do now?
I set him up for that, and what we'll do now is we'll have dinner soon. No, I mean, I think that is the crux of the matter, and I think that's one of the reasons we're having this gathering is what do we do now? But again, I think it was a very informative and fruitful set of discussions, and certainly as a neurosurgeon I learned an immense amount, but I hope each and every one of you has learned a great deal about what your colleagues are doing, and I look forward to continuing our discussions tomorrow. And again, thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedules. So we'll see you.